There's a photo, a truly disturbing one that circulated widely. It shows a dead man propped up against a door, a rifle resting in his lifeless hands, surrounded by grinning lawmen. This man was labeled Ned Christie, the notorious Cherokee outlaw. But what if that label, that entire story spun around this image, was a carefully constructed lie? What if the man hunted, besieged by cannon fire, and ultimately displayed like a trophy, was actually innocent of the crime that sealed his fate? That photograph, stark and unsettling, presents a narrative Ned Christie, the dangerous Cherokee outlaw, finally brought down. But the historical record demands scrutiny. What forces shaped the man before the myth? To understand Ned Christie, one must first understand the world that created him, a world of profound change, cultural resilience, and encroaching conflict within the Cherokee Nation. Ned Christie entered the world on December 14, 1852. His birthplace was not yet Oklahoma, but the Going Snake District of the Cherokee Nation, a region recognized by treaty distinct from the expanding United States territory that would later subsume it. His father, Wade Watt Christie, known also as Wakyu, had been born decades earlier, in 1817, in the ancestral Cherokee homelands of Tennessee, a vast domain that once stretched over 120,000 square miles across parts of 8 future states. Before sustained European contact initiated by Hernando de Soto's expedition in 1540, the Cherokee thrived as a settled people in the American Southeast. Their society was built on agriculture, tending crops in established villages. Their language belonged to the Iroquoian family. Over centuries of interaction with Europeans and later Americans, significant cultural exchange occurred. Many Cherokee adopted elements of European culture, including converting to Christianity and establishing schools for their children. They became known alongside the Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, and Seminole as one of the 5 civilized tribes. This designation applied by white settlers acknowledged their adoption of practices mirroring American society. The development of a unique written language using Sequoia's syllabary, the publication of newspapers, the ratification of a written constitution modeled after the U.S. system, and the construction of log homes and cultivated farms. In a complex reflection of their southern neighbors, some affluent Cherokee even established plantations operated with enslaved African American labor. However, the Cherokee Nation's assimilation and established sovereignty could not protect its land rich with resources like iron ore and gold. Driven by the desire for this wealth and land for white settlement, the United States government enacted the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This policy culminated in the forced expulsion of approximately 60,000 members of the 5 civilized tribes from their ancestral homes. The brutal journey west, known as the Trail of Tears, directly impacted Ned Christie's family. They undertook the forced march in 1839. Among the estimated 3,000 to 4,000 Cherokee who perished from disease, starvation, and exposure during the removal was Ned's great-grandmother, Betsy. The Christie family survivors of this trauma resettled in the Going Snake District in the northeastern part of the designated Indian Territory. This new land, while unfamiliar, was fertile and abundant. Deer, bear, squirrels, rabbits, and wild turkeys populated the forests. Clear streams provided water. Timber was plentiful, and wild plums and berries offered sustenance. Here, the Christies reestablished their lives as farmers, raising dairy cows and chickens, cultivating fields of corn, beans, potatoes, and squash, and participating in the local trade network with neighboring farms. The Christie family belonged to the Kituwa Society, regarded as one of the more traditionalist factions within the Cherokee Nation, maintaining strong connections to older customs, even amidst widespread cultural change. It is crucial to differentiate the settled agricultural Cherokee from nomadic bison-hunting plains tribes like the Comanche. The Cherokee lived in permanent houses and practiced farming. The Cherokee quickly rebuilt institutions in their new territory. Tahlequah, the capital city, near where Ned grew up, became a center of Cherokee governance and commerce. By the 1880s, it boasted a Cherokee courthouse, a hotel, grist mills, pharmacies, a post office, law offices, doctors' clinics, and even telephone lines demonstrating a continued commitment to organized modern society. Ned Christie received a formal education up to the 8th grade, acquiring literacy in both English and the Cherokee syllabary. Stability, however, remained precarious. When Ned was 10 years old, the American Civil War erupted, fracturing the United States and deeply dividing the Cherokee Nation itself. While many Cherokee sided with the Confederacy, influenced by factors including the practice of slavery among some members, the Christie family aligned with the Union. They opposed slavery, and Ned's father, Watt, served as a soldier in the Union forces. The war's aftermath brought further turmoil to Indian Territory. Lawlessness increased significantly as the region became a refuge for outlaws and displaced individuals from across the fractured nation. Despite this often volatile environment, Ned Christie's youth appears relatively conventional for the time and place. He engaged in typical pursuits like playing marbles and the traditional game of stickball. He also developed considerable skill as a fiddle player, a talent that brought entertainment to community gatherings. He was growing up Cherokee in a nation striving to maintain its identity and sovereignty against relentless external pressures and internal divisions, a complex inheritance that would shape the man who later stood accused before the world. The man who would become infamous stood at an average height, contrary to later exaggerated accounts depicting him as towering over 6 feet tall. Period photographs confirm a man of typical stature for his time. Ned Christie possessed significant practical skills, having learned the blacksmith trade from his father. This foundation extended into a specialized expertise. Gunsmithing. He demonstrated considerable proficiency in modifying and handling firearms. His last wife, Nancy, would later attest to his speed when drawing a weapon. Among his personal arms were pistols inherited from his father, likely percussion revolvers carried during the Civil War, which Ned skillfully converted from black powder cap and ball mechanisms to fire self-contained metallic cartridges, a common and practical adaptation for the era. Beyond his craft, a defining aspect of Ned Christie's adult life was his deep engagement with Cherokee governance. He identified strongly with Cherokee traditionalist values, holding profound concern for the welfare and future autonomy of his people. The Cherokee Nation operated under a constitution mirroring the United States system, featuring distinct executive, judicial, and legislative branches. The legislature consisted of 2 bodies, the National Committee Upper House and the National Council Lower House. Ned Christie earned the respect of his community and was elected as a representative to the National Council. In this role, Ned participated directly in the nation's legislative process. Council members deliberated on critical matters, examining treaty stipulations with the U.S. government. Considering the impeachment of Cherokee officials, amending existing laws, confirming the appointments of district sheriffs, and appropriating tribal funds. His political positions reflected a nuanced perspective. He supported local Cherokee seminaries, recognizing the need for younger generations to understand the encroaching white world. Yet he remained a fervent advocate for the preservation of Cherokee language and cultural practices. The council frequently addressed complex social issues arising from increased contact with non-Cherokee populations. One significant concern involved the growing number of intermarriages, often motivated by white individuals seeking access to Cherokee land rights through marriage. The council, including Ned, held the responsibility of vetting and authorizing marriages between Cherokee citizens and outsiders, as well as adjudicating divorces or cases where an outside husband was discovered to have another wife elsewhere. Ned also voiced opposition to proposals allowing railroad construction across Cherokee lands, viewing it as another vector for external intrusion and erosion of sovereignty. Perhaps his most significant political stance was his vehement opposition to the General Allotment Act of 1887, commonly known as the Dawes Act. This federal legislation mandated the breakup of communally held tribal lands. Territory was to be divided into individual parcels. Allotments assigned to tribal members. Any land remaining after allotment was declared surplus and opened for sale primarily to non-native settlers. For traditionalists like Ned, the Dawes Act represented a direct assault on Cherokee land, tenure sovereignty, and cultural identity. a mechanism designed to dismantle the tribal structure and force assimilation, what some termed cultural genocide through assimilation. Even before the events that cast him as a fugitive, Ned Christie's life was not devoid of violence. At age 19, an altercation occurred at a community dance. Another man, reportedly intoxicated improperly, took the hand of Nanny Dick, whom Ned was courting. Ned confronted the man, drawing a pistol. When the other man drew his own weapon, Ned fired, striking him in the shoulder. Ned subsequently married Nanny Dick, but the union proved short-lived. She left him after approximately 2 years and later married Ned's own father, Wat Christie. Ned would marry 4 times in total Nanny Dick, Peggy Tucker, with whom he had a son, James, before Peggy's death around 1880. Jenny Scraper married in 1881, but divorced about a year later, reportedly due to her disapproval of his drinking. And finally, Nancy Grease, whom he married around 1886. Alcohol appears to have been a recurring factor in moments of conflict. On Christmas Eve, 1884, Ned and his brother Jack were out hunting pigeons. After drinking, an argument erupted with William Pallone. Believing Pallone had directed an insult towards his mother, Ned raised his Winchester rifle and fired 3 shots into Pallone, killing him. Ned was arrested and stood trial for Pallone's murder in the Cherokee Nation court. He was ultimately acquitted primarily because no witnesses could definitively state they saw Ned pull the trigger. However, years later, Ned's brother Jack reportedly confessed that both he and Ned had fired at Pallone, with Ned firing the first shot. These earlier violent incidents, alongside associations involving other relatives such as a half-brother linked to the outlaw Blue Duck, provided fodder for exaggerated press accounts and dime novel narratives that proliferated after Ned was accused of killing Marshal Maples, painting a picture of a life steeped in violence long before he became a hunted man. The event that irrevocably altered Ned Christie's life and forged his outlaw reputation occurred in May 1887. United States Deputy Marshal Daniel Maples entered the Cherokee Nation, leading a posse tasked with addressing the persistent issue of illegal liquor trafficking within the territory. While operating near Tahlequah, the nation's capital, Maples was ambushed under the cover of darkness. Shot by an unseen assailant, he succumbed to his wounds the following day. The killing of a federal officer immediately triggered an investigation under U.S. authority. Accounts of the ambush varied, but suspicion quickly fell upon individuals known to operate outside the law. Bub Traynor, a man with a documented criminal history, became a primary suspect. Law enforcement sought Traynor and his known associates, including John Paris, Charlie Bobtail, John Hogshooter, and Looney Coon. When apprehended or questioned, all initially denied involvement. The narrative fractured further as accusations flew among the suspects. Charlie Bobtail and Bub Traynor pointed the finger at John Paris, claiming he was the shooter. John Paris, in turn, deflected the blame, naming Ned Christie as the man who killed Deputy Marshal Maples. Ned Christie was indeed present in Tahlequah on the night of the shooting. He had been attending a session of the National Council and was later observed at a residence where liquor was known to be sold illicitly. It is plausible he had been drinking that evening. Crucially, the identity of the victim, a white U.S. Deputy Marshal, meant jurisdiction over the murder investigation fell outside the Cherokee Nation's court system. The case was transferred to the federal court for the Western District of Arkansas, presided over by Judge Isaac C. Parker in Fort Smith. This court held jurisdiction over federal crimes committed in the Indian Territory. The other men implicated in the Maples killing, Traynor, Paris, Bobtail, and Hogshooter, eventually submitted to the Fort Smith court's authority. They appeared before Judge Parker, and through various legal outcomes, none received significant prison sentences. Some were acquitted outright. Only Ned Christie, though formally indicted based on Paris's accusation, refused to make the journey to Fort Smith and surrender to federal custody. His reasons for defying the court order remain a subject of historical debate. Perhaps the collective memory of past injustices, such as the forced removal decades earlier, or violent clashes like the Going Snake Massacre of 1872, where Cherokee citizens attempting to conduct their own court proceedings were attacked by federal marshals, fostered a deep distrust of the American legal system. Judge Parker himself possessed a formidable reputation, known as the hanging judge. For the large number of death sentences handed down from his bench, he inspired fear in many who faced his court. Christie, despite the acquittals of the other suspects, may have calculated that appearing in Fort Smith carried an unacceptable risk of execution regardless of his guilt or innocence. Whatever his reasoning, Ned Christie's failure to appear had immediate and severe consequences. In the eyes of federal authorities and much of the public, his refusal signaled guilt. A story later circulated that Christie attempted to negotiate, purportedly writing a letter to Judge Parker, denying his involvement in Maples's death and offering to surrender if granted bail, allowing him time to gather evidence proving his innocence. However, this letter has never been found, and its existence remains unverified. With Christie defying the indictment, Judge Parker acted decisively. He issued federal warrants directing U.S. Marshals to enter the Cherokee Nation, apprehend Ned Christie, and bring him to Fort Smith for trial. From that point forward, Ned Christie was officially designated a federal fugitive and outlaw hunted by the United States government. His life as a respected councilman and craftsman was over. The long, violent chapter of his resistance had begun. Designated a federal fugitive, Ned Christie did not flee the Cherokee Nation or go into deep hiding. Instead, he simply returned to his home in the Going Snake District. He resigned his position on the National Council and ceased traveling to Tahlequah, effectively withdrawing from public life but remaining in his community. His general location was known, yet federal authorities did not immediately prioritize his capture. More than 2 years passed following the Maples killing and the issuance of the warrant before a concerted effort was made to apprehend him. In the late summer of 1889, United States Marshal Jacob Yos, responsible for the Fort Smith Federal District encompassing the Indian Territory, assigned the task of bringing in Ned Christie to one of his most capable deputies, Heck Thomas. Thomas was already a figure of note in the West. His experience included service as a courier during the Civil War time with the Atlanta Police Force, work as a railroad guard employment with the Fort Worth Detective Association, and ultimately appointment as a deputy U.S. Marshal, along with fellow deputies Bill Tilghman and Chris Madsen. Thomas formed the trio famously known as the Three Guardsmen lawmen, renowned for their efforts to combat widespread lawlessness in the Indian Territory. In September 1889, Heck Thomas led a posse of 4 other men to Ned Christie's home. Arriving at the cabin, they surrounded the structure and called for Christie to surrender. Ned's response came not with words, but with gunfire directed from the loft window of his house. A firefight erupted during the exchange. A nearby outbuilding caught fire, and the flames quickly spread to Ned's log cabin. One of Thomas's men, Deputy L.P. Isbell, was struck in the shoulder by a bullet fired from the house. Accounts suggest others were inside the cabin with Ned during the attack: his wife Nancy, his 13-year-old son James, and his 18-year-old cousin, known as Little Arch Wolf. Amidst the gunfire and spreading flames, Nancy and James managed to escape the burning structure unharmed. Little Arch Wolf also attempted to flee but was shot and wounded by the deputies as he emerged. Believing they had shot their primary target, Ned Christie, and needing urgent medical attention for the wounded Deputy Isbell, the posse hastily withdrew from the scene. Ned Christie had not escaped unscathed. He sustained injuries during the firefight, though reports differ on the exact nature. Some claim his nose was shot off, others that he lost an eye. However, subsequent events confirm he was not blinded. After the posse departed, Nancy found both Ned and Little Arch Wolf alive, though wounded, and arranged for their medical care. The destruction of his home marked a profound turning point for Ned. Any thoughts he might have entertained about surrendering vanished. He resolved never to submit to the authority of the Fort Smith court, choosing instead to remain within the borders of the Cherokee Nation, whatever the cost. He reportedly declared, I would rather die at home in my nation with my people. I will not die in the white man's country. Putting this resolve into action, Ned constructed a new dwelling designed explicitly for defense. It was no ordinary cabin, but a veritable log fortress. He built it with double-layered log walls, packing the space between the inner and outer layers with sand to absorb bullets. Strategically placed loopholes or gun ports were cut into the walls, allowing occupants to fire outwards while remaining largely protected from incoming shots. Understanding the potential for future sieges, he began stockpiling essential supplies, food, water, and substantial quantities of ammunition. Following this first armed confrontation, the federal government increased the pressure. A bounty of $500 was placed on Ned Christie's head, an amount later doubled to $1,000, dead or alive. This substantial reward further incentivized pursuit by lawmen and bounty hunters. In the nearly 3 years between the first siege in 1889 and the final confrontation in 1892, Ned Christie's reputation in the press transformed dramatically. Newspapers hungry for sensational stories from the Wild West published increasingly lurid and often entirely fabricated accounts of his activities. He was depicted as a remorseless killer, a prolific bootlegger, a robber of stores, and a murderer of innocents. Inflammatory labels became commonplace. Bad Indian, the most reckless man in the Indian Territory, notorious outlaw, desperado, ferocious, and a man possessing a deep-seated hatred of the law. This mythology proved durable, persisting long after his death. As late as 1970, a popular Time Life book on the Old West described him inaccurately as a train robber, horse thief, and whiskey peddler. While it is likely Ned engaged in some illicit whiskey trade, bootlegging to support himself during his time as a fugitive, evidence supporting the more sensational claims of train robbery, bank robbery, or large-scale horse theft is non-existent. Another incident often conflated with his outlaw status was the killing of a man named Bear Grimmett in February 1888, potentially stemming from a dispute over a liquor shipment. Press accounts wildly exaggerated this event, claiming Ned and a fictitious outlaw gang hunted Grimmett down because he possessed incriminating information. In reality, Ned Christie faced trial for Grimmett's death in a Cherokee court and was acquitted based on witness testimony asserting he was not the shooter. Despite this acquittal under Cherokee law, the federal warrant for the Maples killing remained active, the sole legal basis for his fugitive status in the eyes of the United States. Why federal marshals took nearly 3 years after the failed 1889 siege to mount another serious attempt to capture Christie remains unclear. The vastness and ruggedness of the territory, coupled with the sheer volume of violent crime and the presence of numerous other outlaws requiring the marshals' attention, likely played a significant role. During this period, another persistent myth arose, linking Ned Christie with the legendary black deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. Stories circulated claiming one had killed the other, but historical records confirm the two lawmen likely never even crossed paths. Ned Christie remained fortified in his rebuilt home, a symbol of defiance against federal authority, while his legend grew fueled by rumor and the sensationalist press. 3 years elapsed after the first failed attempt before federal lawmen returned in force to capture Ned Christie. In October 1892, another posse approached his fortified home, arriving in the morning as Ned was eating breakfast. The familiar ritual unfolded, a demand for surrender met immediately by rifle fire from within the fort. During this exchange, Ned wounded 2 deputies, one shot in the leg, the other in the neck. Again, an outbuilding was set ablaze, but Christie's reinforced log structure, unlike his previous home, resisted the flames. The posse had brought dynamite this time, but initial attempts to light the fuses failed in the heat of the fight. Frustrated, they sent word back to Marshal Dawes requesting reinforcements before any backup could arrive. However, Ned Christie slipped away from the besieged fort under the cover of the surrounding terrain and disappeared into the hills. Subsequent newspaper reports falsely claimed the posse had burned the fort and recovered stolen goods inside. Marshal Dawes did not wait long to renew the effort. Just 23 days after the October attempt on November 3, 1892, he dispatched a significantly larger and better equipped force. This final posse numbered approximately 22 men. Command was given to Gideon Cap White. Among the posse members was Ben Knight, a Cherokee lawman also belonging to the traditional Tahlequah society, specifically included to deliver surrender demands in both Cherokee and English, ensuring no misunderstanding. As the posse surrounded the fort in the pre-dawn hours, several people were inside with Ned, his wife Nancy, her son from a previous relationship Albert, Ned's daughter Mary, and her young daughter Charlotte, and possibly Ned's cousin Arch Wolf, who had apparently recovered from the wound sustained during the 1889 siege. Also present was Charles Hare, a 12-year-old Cherokee boy who worked for Ned. At daybreak, Arch Wolf emerged from the fort. Accounts diverged sharply on what happened next. Some deputies claimed Wolf opened fire, prompting them to shoot back. Other accounts suggest Wolf was not fired upon, and it remains uncertain if he discharged a weapon at all. One later report insisted that only Ned Christie and the young boy Charles Hare were the male defenders inside the fort when the main engagement began. The formal demands for surrender were issued, called out clearly in both Cherokee by Ben Knight and in English by others. As before, Ned Christie's only reply was gunfire from the fort's loopholes. This time, the posse was prepared for a protracted fight and brought heavier ordnance, more dynamite, and a small cannon, likely a 3-pounder field gun. The cannon proved surprisingly ineffective against the sand-filled double-log walls. Deputies fired multiple rounds, but the cannonballs reportedly glanced off the resilient structure without breaching it. Frustrated with the lack of effect, the posse eventually overloaded the cannon with a large charge of black powder in an attempt to increase its power, resulting only in the cannon itself bursting. The firefight settled into a long siege lasting throughout the day and into the night. Gunfire echoed through the surrounding hills as the posse maintained their positions, exchanging shots with the lone defender inside the fort. Around 4:00 a.m., under the cover of darkness, the posse initiated their final assault plan. They commandeered a heavy farm wagon, likely taken from Christie's property, and began pushing it slowly towards the fort, using its bulk as a mobile shield against rifle fire. Protected behind the wagon, Deputy Charlie Copeland managed to reach the base of the fort's wall. He carried several sticks of dynamite with fuses prepared. Copeland placed the charges against the logs and ignited the fuses before retreating behind the wagon. The resulting explosion was devastating. It ripped a large hole through the double log walls, shattering timbers and instantly igniting the dry wood. The carefully constructed fortress was breached and rapidly filling with smoke and flames. This action left Ned Christie with no choice but to evacuate the burning structure. Accounts of Ned Christie's final moments vary significantly. Some reports claimed he burst out of the breach aggressively, perhaps firing a pistol as he ran. Others described him staggering out, disoriented, his clothes possibly damaged or blown partially off by the blast collapsing after only a few steps. One deputy later provided a sensationalized and inaccurate account claiming Christie stumbled out and that 7 members of his supposed gang lay dead around the fort. No evidence supports the presence of a gang or other fatalities among defenders besides Christie. Marshal Yoas himself later stated that due to the darkness and the volume of fire from the posse members surrounding the breach, it was impossible to know definitively who fired the fatal shot. Whether Ned emerged shooting, attempting to flee the flames, or perhaps having exhausted his ammunition is unclear. Marshal Yoas reported that Ned managed to fire 1 shot from his pistol before being struck multiple times by the posse's gunfire, hit in the shoulder, head, and side. Ned Christie, aged 39, fell dead outside the burning ruins of his home. Inside the inferno, tragedy compounded. The 12-year-old boy, Charles Hare, remained trapped within the burning structure. He survived, but suffered severe burns before he could be rescued or escape. The long standoff had ended in violent death and destruction. Following Ned Christie's death outside his burning fort, the posse undertook the grim task of transporting his body. They carried it back to Fort Smith, Arkansas, primarily to claim the substantial $1,000 federal bounty offered for him dead or alive. Upon arrival, a decision was made that would cement Christie's image in public memory in a particularly macabre fashion. His corpse was propped upright against a door, a rifle placed in his lifeless hands, and the victorious lawmen gathered around to pose for photographs. This disturbing image quickly circulated, becoming the definitive visual representation of the notorious Cherokee outlaw. The photograph served as a stark trophy, a practice sometimes seen in that era, intended perhaps as definitive proof that the fugitive had been eliminated. The image was commercialized, reproduced on postcards sold in local shops, further disseminating the narrative of Christie as a dangerous criminal brought to justice. Close examination of the post-mortem photographs reveals Ned Christie with short hair, contrasting with images from his life showing longer hair common among traditional Cherokee men. According to research by author Devin A. Mahasua, citing family accounts, Ned anticipated his impending death. Following Cherokee customs associated with mourning and preparing for death, he asked his wife Nancy to cut his long hair shortly before the final siege. She reportedly wrapped the shorn hair, offered prayers over it, and buried it near their home. The rifle seen in the photograph was also not his own. It belonged to one of the deputies who reportedly suggested its inclusion because Christie had died by the gun, adding another layer of staged artifice to the scene. The public display and commodification of Christie's corpse become profoundly unsettling when considering the persistent questions surrounding his guilt in the crime that made him a fugitive. The possibility, perhaps probability, that he was innocent of killing Marshal Maples casts the entire manhunt, the siege, his death at the hands of federal agents at his own home, and the subsequent treatment of his body in a deeply troubling light. Over time, the belief that Ned Christie was wrongly accused has gained considerable traction. Even Marshal Jacob Yos, in correspondence following the siege, expressed regret that Christie had been killed rather than captured alive and brought to trial. While there is no definitive proof that Christie would not have received a fair trial before Judge Parker, the historical context of widespread injustice and broken treaties experienced by Native Americans provides a strong basis for understanding his profound distrust of the federal legal system. His decision to resist rather than surrender cannot be divorced from that reality. The fundamental questions linger. Did Ned Christie actually shoot Daniel Maples? If he did not, who did? Answers remain elusive. About 20 years after Christie's death, a Cherokee freedman named Dick Humphrey reportedly came forward claiming he witnessed the Maples shooting and that the killer was Bub Traynor. However, significant inconsistencies plague Humphrey's account, most notably his failure to provide this information earlier, particularly after Bub Traynor himself died in 1896. Questions also exist regarding the circumstances of Humphrey's alleged confession and whether he was accurately represented or even still alive in 1918 when the account surfaced. The precise events of that fatal night in Tahlequah in 1887 remain obscured by conflicting narratives and the passage of time. It is noteworthy that the 4 other men initially implicated alongside Christie in the Maples killing Paris bobtail hogshooter and Traynor all ultimately avoided conviction or significant punishment in Judge Parker's court. Some historians suggest Christie's refusal to appear, making him appear guilty by default, may have inadvertently aided the others in securing their freedom. Bub Traynor, a man of mixed Cherokee heritage whose sister reportedly held some social influence, may have benefited from connections that helped deflect scrutiny. Author Devin A. Mahasua posits that John Paris is a plausible candidate for the actual shooter based on accusations made by Charlie Bobtail and the fact that Paris left the territory after 1890. Many who examine the case, considering Christie's life before the accusation and his decision not to flee the nation, but rather return home, conclude he was likely innocent of Maples's murder. Eventually, Ned Christie's body was released to his grieving father. What? Christie Watt transported his son's remains back to the Going Snake District and buried him within the Cherokee Nation at the Watt Christie Cemetery near Bidding Springs, Oklahoma. Watt Christie himself was later laid to rest in the same family cemetery. Ned's last wife, Nancy Grease. Christie lived until 1921 and was buried in the Jack Christie Cemetery. Tragically, the land encompassing that cemetery was later sold, and the burial ground itself was inundated and destroyed during the creation of Lake Yucha Reservoir in the 1980s. The aftermath of the siege brought dire consequences for others present. Ned's young cousin, Little Arch Wolf, and the 12-year-old boy, Charles Hare, were both arrested and charged with assault with intent to kill a federal officer for their alleged roles in defending the fort. Due to his youth, Charles Hare received a comparatively lighter sentence, 3 years in a federal reformatory in Illinois, far from his home and family. Records are unclear whether he served the full term, but he was documented as living back in Oklahoma in 1902. He died young at age 27 in 1907. Little Arch Wolf faced a much harsher fate. He served several years in federal prison before being transferred in 1903 to the Canton Asylum for Insane Indians in South Dakota. This institution, operating from 1898 to 1934 under the name Hiawatha Insane Asylum for Indians, held a dark reputation. Investigations, including one in 1927, revealed that many inmates were not suffering from mental illness, but had been confined for reasons such as alcoholism, political dissent against government or corporate interests, or simple cultural misunderstandings by authorities. Conditions were often deplorable. During its operation, 121 individuals died while confined at Canton, representing nearly 30% of all those admitted. Little Arch Wolf became one of those 121 fatalities dying within the asylum walls, despite the distinct possibility he never fired a weapon during either siege. The asylum was demolished in 1975, replaced incongruously by a golf course. Arch Wolf's remains lie somewhere beneath the manicured grass, likely between the 4th and 5th fairways. Mihisua's research uncovered heartbreaking letters from Arch's grandfather pleading for information about his grandson during his confinement at Canton. Pleas that went unanswered by asylum authorities. The story of Ned Christie, tangled with violence, injustice, and enduring mystery, reflects the broader historical struggles of Native American nations confronting relentless pressure on their lands, sovereignty, and cultures. While contemporary statistics often highlight ongoing disparities faced by Native Americans in areas like poverty, healthcare, and education, there are also indicators of progress and perseverance, such as increasing representation in government and disproportionately high rates of military service. Ned Christie's life moved from respected Cherokee councilman to hunted fugitive, a shift ignited by an accusation he likely was innocent of. His defiance culminating in a deadly siege against federal forces armed with dynamite and cannon became legendary. Yet the core questions of his guilt and the true events surrounding Marshal Maples' death remain unanswered, leaving a complex legacy of resistance and potential injustice.